is Brad Hoge. He's the Director of Teacher Support at the National Center for Science Education. He'll discuss the misinformation and misconception problem, how misinformation targets misconception, and what NCSE is doing about it. Brad?
Thank you very much. No, it really is my pleasure to be here. Let me just mention this title, and I'm using M&M instead of misinformation, misconception, because there's some history to this. As the Director of Teacher Support at NCSE, my major program is a Teacher Ambassador program. And the initial pilot study for that program was supported by a grant, and the title for the proposal was Misinformation, or Turning Misinformation into Educational Opportunities, or TMEO. And I'm a fan of acronyms, but most of the people I work with are not. So I kept using TMEO sort of as a reference to that program. But when people would ask me what it meant, I wouldn't always say turning misinformation into educational opportunities. I would switch misconceptions in there. And I think it was mostly just absent-mindedly rather than intentionally. But it realized over time that really the two terms are interchangeable. And it says a lot about what it is we're actually trying to do. And that is to target misinformation by helping teachers teach to misconceptions. It's a misconception-based approach that inoculates students against misinformation. So I've given up on the acronym at work because I couldn't convince anybody of the utility of that chimeric impact of the two M's there. But for me personally, this is still kind of a mission statement for me, and that is inoculating students against misinformation by teaching them how to spot and recognize and then understand where a misconception comes from. So that's where this came from, but I'm going to go through a lot more of the underlying reason for why this is necessary and why this approach is effective. I won't spend much time talking actually about the science of climate change or even really the pedagogy of teaching to the students. I'm going to be talking mostly about this particular process of inoculation through against misinformation through focusing on misconceptions, and I'm going to skip around a little bit. I mean, I'm providing these bullet points just as a way for you to see sort of where I'm going to go with this, but I'm not going to be linear. I'm not a very linear thinker anyway, so it's a challenge. It would be a challenge for me to do that. I'll probably jump around even more than I prepared, but certainly there will be questions at the end, and I will go to lunch and answer questions there as well. So I do want to talk about why people have misconceptions in the first place. I'll list some of the top 5 misconceptions in climate change and evolution. The National Center for Science Education, just to give you some background on our organization, we began in the 80s. Eugenie Scott was our founder and our first executive director, and we were focused entirely on evolution. We were involved in many of the court battles over evolution. Kitzmiller versus Dover, for instance, we helped organize a lot of that effort. We've constantly been in the forefront of making sure that evolution is taught in schools and taught well in schools. And so we've battled fights over school standards and on and on. Since about 2004 or 5, we added climate change because we noticed a lot of the same strategies for undermining the teaching or understanding of climate change that we recognize in evolution. It's the same strategy. It isn't just evolution and climate change. You can read Naomi Oreskes' book. I'll point that out to you a little bit later. The Merchants of Doubt. The same strategy is used to undermine science anytime it's somewhat controversial politically or for an industry's purpose to do so. So the methods of misinformation are well known, and we took on climate change in addition to evolution because of that. We've also recently, just in the last few years, decided that we need to be more proactive about our approach to helping teachers. We've always been involved in what we call flare-ups, and that is responding to, situations in which a teacher was directly challenged in their classrooms, or again, not allowed to teach, threatened, their jobs were threatened, so on. We call these flare-ups. We still do this. We still look for these flare-ups all around the country and help support teachers in difficult situations. But we just realized that we want to be more proactive in terms of preparing teachers because we've done our own surveys, and we realized that only about 40% of the teachers in their own classrooms feel confident to teach these subjects. Now that reflects a lot of different reasons why they're not confident, and it includes about 20% or so, maybe 10 to 20%, who harbor their own misconceptions to a point where they would would be willing to teach creationism or would be willing to debate climate change because that's their own belief, their own ideology. But most of those teachers, most of the 60% that are not comfortable, only 40% are, most of those teachers just never learned it in the first place. They don't feel confident with the content. They don't feel confident teaching it the way it should be taught, which is through inquiry-based methods. And so they avoid it. If they're not required to teach it, they don't. They also avoid professional development on the subject. Right? If you put climate change or evolution in the title of a workshop for teachers to come learn about how to teach it, you're going to get the same 20% coming every time. The other end of that spectrum are the PD warriors, the teachers who get all the professional development they can. They're constantly trying to find new ways to improve their teaching. So that leaves a pretty big middle that just is hard to reach. And this isn't just for evolution and climate change. It's something that as I've been in the sort of the STEM education business for a long time. It's hard to get to that middle group of teachers. It's always been hard. So finding a strategy to get there is what we're looking for. So that's sort of part of what NCSE is doing to combat this problem. I'll talk a little bit about that. I'll spend most of my time in the middle here talking about how misinformation targets misconceptions specifically. And I'll end up with some tips, how you can help fight misinformation when you encounter it. I'm sure most of you are already very adept at this, but maybe there's something in there that you can use. So again, NCSE, this is our mission statement. We promote and defend accurate and effective science education because we believe sincerely that everyone deserves to engage with the evidence. And the key in this is the last word, the very last word there, evidence. So I'll talk a lot about that. We do know that obviously you're not going to change anyone's mind simply by throwing facts at them. So by evidence, I'm not really necessarily just saying tell them the right thing and they'll believe you. It's very clear that people aren't convinced simply by facts. So there's strategies that have to be used to get people to focus on the evidence, because once you do get people to actually focus on evidence, evidence is pretty convincing. I'm not alone in this effort, but we are a very small, plucky group. I'm using that phrase because it'll come up again a little bit later. Ann Reed is our executive director. Glenn Branch is our deputy director. And so these are people that, again, Glenn's been with the organization the longest. He deals specifically with the flare-up work that I mentioned. I'll mention Kate again a little bit later on. She's the sort of a parallel to me. She's a community engagement director. And I'm the education director. We have a communication director, development director, and so on. But I won't introduce everybody on this list, but just to point out that we really are a pretty small group trying to have a national impact. So I think we're able to do so because we have some experience doing this. All right, let me get into the nature of the talk. Let me get to what I'm here for. I want to identify the nature of misconceptions, and this is mostly from an education standpoint. But it works in a larger context as well. There's kind of two routes to misconceptions. The first one is what I call misratiocination, which is simply normal misconception. The misconceptions we all have, because we either have gaps in our understanding of something, and so we fill in those gaps with our own bad logic, or there are some counterintuitive aspects of reality that are just really hard to grapple with, and so it's real easy to have the wrong impression or the wrong idea. There are some logical fallacies, of course, that come into play that work on these, and so that's sort of the key to how misinformation approaches this. But we also have misconceptions because of our own rationalization, our own cognitive biases, our own reasons why we don't want to believe something when it's presented to us, and we find a way to rationalize an understanding of a subject that's different from what reality would actually be. So that obviously is going to give us a lot of opportunity, again, for an intentional misinformation strategy to be effective. I'm going to do a little more detail on this, just to point out a couple of the key aspects that are specifically involved in misinformation or misconceptions about climate change and evolution. It's actually evolutionary psychology, and we're learning more and more about how the human mind actually evolved to deal with situations that we no longer encounter, but it's actually made it harder for our mind to grapple with some of the things that we do encounter. I mean, evolution is a perfect example. I love the quote from E.O. Wilson that we evolved to accept one reality and discovered another. In other words, we evolved as mystical thinkers. There's a reason why that was adaptive for us in our evolutionary history. That doesn't serve us well anymore. right? So we'll get to some of that, but more specifically, we're not very good at probability. I mean, our minds just don't really work or don't understand probabilistic things very well. And so when we're talking about climate change and we're talking about changing frequencies over time, and we're talking about time frames that may be on the order of not only decades and centuries, but for a full understanding, hundreds of thousands of years, or even millions of years, it's very difficult for the human mind to really get a good grasp of that without a pretty extensive education or training in doing so. We don't understand deep time very well, so obviously if we extend even beyond into evolutionary time frames, it's very difficult for people to truly understand millions of years and billions of years and change that can take place slowly over that length of time. The second group here, though, are, again, the ones that are more pertinent to misinformation campaigns. And we're seeing a lot of this in the news now. I mean, it's becoming a big issue because it's becoming more and more recognized that this is what's underneath the inability or the intransigence of people who resist believing in climate change. It works with evolution as well, but really right now the hot button topic in the news is climate change as much as it is in the news, which isn't really that much, but as much as it is in the news, a lot of it focuses on how our sort of tribal affiliations are causing this polarization of people who think climate change is the most important thing to deal with right now, and people who are just completely in denial that climate change is a problem at all. And we all do this. We all line up with our own groups. Here we are. We're here because we affiliate with each other. We feel an affiliation as humanists, that we have a specific approach, and we have certain beliefs and opinions that align with that, and we tend to then stay within that group. And it's not a problem. That in itself is not a problem. Okay, but we'll see how that can be taken advantage of a little bit later. All right.
Wait.
Yes.
With ratiocination. I'm not. I mean, because the affiliation with the groups, I'm getting.
Right.
What you're saying. Affiliation with ratiocination.
Well,
could you repeat the question?
Yeah, her question was to explain what I mean by the affiliation with ratiocination. In other words, she said the affiliation with groups makes sense, but what do I mean by this? In other words, the way we think and the way we form our own understanding of something, how we form explanation for things. And this is kind of a tricky connection between the top group and the bottom group, the sort of the religious barriers we might have to seeing an explanation that is in front of us, that we kind of train ourselves to think in a certain way. Now, as a scientist, I see the value of thinking like a scientist. I see the value of being able to take all of the evidence and all of it together, put an explanatory framework together that can account for all of that evidence, and then make predictions about what might be true for a question I haven't found an answer for yet. That's a specific pathway of ratiocination. Not everyone thinks that way, and part of the problem is we need to get students more scientifically literate so that they're able to think in a way that allows them to see problems and find solutions for those problems in the real world. Some people are trained differently. They're trained to think in a way that doesn't necessarily value evidence in the same way. Again, I mentioned mystical thinking, and that's kind of along the lines of what I mean here. There are different logics, and logic by itself is not enough. I remember sitting in a coffee shop one time, and there was a group of humanists at one table, and they were talking about a number of things. There was a group of a Bible study at another table, and they were talking about things from their point of view, and I could hear well enough to hear their arguments, and both groups had very solid logic based on the assumptions that they made from the beginning, right? So the assumptions at the beginning made all the difference in their conclusions, but the logic in between was sound for either group, right? I mean, if you start with bad assumptions, you're not going to find good conclusions. So part of what I mean by this is as a species, we need to learn how to investigate our own assumptions, test them against the real world, and find a way to then problem solve beyond that. So I hope that answers your question. Okay. That was a great question. All right, as I mentioned before, I mentioned merchants of doubt. I bring this up because the next few slides are going to kind of detail what I mean by how misinformation targets misconceptions. What are the strategies of misinformation? And these tend to be intentional propaganda, intentional attempts to undermine real understanding of something for whatever purpose. And again, with Merchants of Doubt, they looked at the tobacco wars and climate change and a couple other things that have been followed the same blueprint, so to speak. The most recent one, and the one that's kind of led to this, my program, my teacher ambassador program, was when the Heartland Institute sent out this booklet on the left, Why Scientists Disagree About Global Warming. They sent that to every single teacher in the country. And it's completely the playbook from Merchants of Doubt. They used fake experts. Fred Singer down there at the bottom is the same, he's a real physicist, but he's the same scientist who the tobacco industry hired to undermine, because basically one of the strategies, and I'll get through these in a little bit, but it's to try to set up a fake expert, somebody who looks like an expert who really isn't. And they'll say what the group wants them to say for various reasons. Anyway, so why scientists disagree. And the 5 misconceptions that I'm going to go through in a little bit were taken directly from this book, and we counter them with the lessons that we developed. And I'm just pointing out that, again, this is following another strategy that we're very familiar with at NCSE, because it's been used to undermine evolution and teaching of evolution developed by the Discovery Institute. They call it the wedge strategy. And it's an attempt to sort of wedge misinformation into people's minds so that they have their own doubts and then they can be more susceptible to misinformation. Now, the motivations for these misinformation strategies, again, can be somewhat sincere. I mean, the Discovery Institute sincerely believes in what they're doing. They are not right in our perspective because their assumptions, again, are starting with something that is not based in real evidence, but they are sincere about it. Companies like the tobacco industry, the oil and gas industry, and so on, and there are instances of some very deliberate disingenuity, right? They know better, but for whatever reason they're sowing doubt through misinformation. So the strategy is generate controversy. This can be done through a false equivalency. In climate change, this is typically done with trying to create a debate and a balanced debate. I'll talk a little bit more about this as we go forward, because this more recent attempt to get this red-blue kind of debate by the Trump administration is an example of a false equivalency. When 97% of scientists agree that humans are causing climate change, that remaining 3% is not an equal side to balance that view. Now, the process of that consensus is another part of why that's a misunderstanding about how science works. So, generally, misinformation will try to present those as equal sides, as a false equivalency, but they'll also generate a lot of controversy by trying to set this up as a conspiracy of sorts, us versus them. Here's a group over here trying to convince you of something that is completely made up, and they're using the strategies, kind of the pot calling the kettle black, trying to claim that the side of the argument that has evidence is using the same strategies of logical fallacy and misinformation that, in fact, the groups on the other side are using. Seeding doubt is a really big part of what they're trying to do, because it isn't so much that they don't have to convince people of their side entirely. They just have to get enough doubt in people's minds that they won't take a side, that they'll sit in the middle. And we'll see where that falls in just a little bit. The alternative facts, the wedging in these alternative facts, and I put, of course, facts in quotes there because we realize that that's kind of a misnomer in itself. There are not alternative facts, there are facts. And so that becomes propaganda, however, that, again, we're trying to trick. And this happens a lot with tribes that try to create an intellectual elite that is trying to fool you or trick you by using what they call facts, when in fact there are different perspectives that would allow for alternative facts to be true. I know I'm not reading my cartoons. I use a lot of cartoons because cartoons are funny because they present misinformation or misconception in some way. So as a teacher, I've used cartoons in my classrooms as a misconception-based approach, and I apologize if you want to for me to stop and explain any of my cartoons as I go along. Just stop me and let me do that. This cartoon in particular, and many of the cartoons that I have, is actually drawn by a colleague in our program called John Cook. John Cook is a climate communication expert. He wrote one of the seminal papers on establishing the 97% number. And so you'll see a picture of him in a little bit. I'm going to talk a lot about the strategy that he uses, that he developed. And so he was actually a cartoonist before he became a science communicator. And matter of fact, he's going to have a book come out pretty soon with all of these cartoons that walk through a lot of the controversies over climate change. So keep your eyes open. It's going to be a really hilarious book. All right. This is what makes misinformation possible. So again, it's part of how it is targeting misconception. And this is true for all of us. And again, I want to emphasize, particularly when I get to my third column here, I want to emphasize a couple things. But number one is most of us, we forget most of what we learn. We don't use it and we don't remember it. This is why, If You're Smarter Than a Fifth Grader was a popular show. Because you can go back into your education and most of what we learned we forgot. Now, we learned how to think. We learned how to learn. But specific details are not something we remember unless we use them every day. But to be honest, we never learned much about climate change or evolution in the first place. These are not topics that are often that are covered very well and are often omitted from our educations. And in fact, a lot of people are taught misinformation instead of good information. So we've got a big battle ahead of us simply because of these two things. That it really is not a blank slate completely, but almost worse, because there's bad information in people's minds. And to uproot a misconception is a lot harder than to avoid it in the first place. Because a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing, right? So if you think you know something, that's pretty sticky. That sticks in your mind. You don't change your mind easily. It really takes experiencing something firsthand through your own experience that allows you to overcome a misconception. Otherwise, you're going to hold on to your misconceptions for dear life. There's a couple reasons why this is particularly true, and again, this is somewhat of evolutionary psychology involved. We are afraid of change. As a species, we're just generally afraid of change. We don't understand probability or deep time, so when we're presented with evidence of something changing over time, it's not something that sticks very easily in our minds. It's just part of our way we think. We're certainly fearful of being taken advantage of. None of us want to feel like we're stupid or ignorant or any of those terms. Those terms themselves are pretty pejorative because of that. We don't tend to trust each other very well, and so we don't trust experts unless there are experts, and then we trust them a lot, right? So again, how we sort of align with certain ways of thinking goes a long way in which experts we choose to trust. We really need a better process of looking at the evidence that the experts are presenting and then finding our trust there. We're also, and I won't elaborate on this too much in this talk, but this is particularly, I think, important for an evolutionary perspective, is that we're fearful of an impersonal universe as a species. And you can almost look at the bell curve of this, which is pretty indicative of it being an inherited trait, an instinct, if you will, of how much we are susceptible to mystical thinking and how much we are somewhat independent of mystical thinking. And if you are somebody who is fearful of an impersonal universe, you are genetically predisposed to be a mystical thinker, that is not something that rationalization or rational thought overcomes. That's a deeply felt emotional instinct that is not available to rational argument. We have to recognize that as we try to find these strategies for talking to people that may be in that camp. But I want to point out that all of us are susceptible to this. This does not align with, well, actually, that's my next slide. I'll get there in my next slide, sorry. Identity, allegiance, as I mentioned before, we do tend to align ourselves with certain things. Some of this is ancestry and heritage. Most of this in the modern world, in our modern culture anyway, is the result of political ideation as well as religious ideation. And we end up in our own echo chambers, and we don't listen to people from the other side. So what I want to get to, what I would just sort of jump the gun on here, was this slide, and that we are all susceptible to this. Because I really do want to make this point. It allows for what I'm going to call radical empathy at the end of the talk, if we all recognize the fact that, yes, the topics that I'm talking about in here today might align with one side of certain spectrums, a political spectrum, for instance, but there are other misconceptions that are just as hard to uproot on the other end of the political spectrum. and that's true of in many cases. So since our own expertise is limited and we choose our experts that we believe in, we're susceptible to the echo chamber effect. We're susceptible to getting that confirmation bias over and over again and making it harder and harder to see something that we've believed that is now not true. I put this slide in there, again, this is from John Cook's work, that shows just exactly how important it is to listen to the right experts, and why it's easy for people who are opposed to climate change to find fake experts. When we talk about 97%, we're talking about climate scientists, scientists who are specifically studying climate. If they're not specifically studying climate, they're not real experts, and so you're more susceptible. I'm a biogeochemist, so I've studied climate change from somewhat of a sort of conceptual framework or whatever, but I've not and never did specifically study climate change. Taught it in my classroom, but I'm somewhat down that curve a little bit. Now, I believe it, of course, but there's some gaps in my knowledge. So when I have a question about climate change, I go to Ben Santer. I ask Ben Santer. He's on our board. He was the author of the IPCC report in 1995 that was the first one to say specifically that humans are causing climate change. And he's borne the brunt of that for most of his career. I mean, he's been attacked in numerous ways because he was the name put on that. But he's an active climate scientist, and so if I have a question, that's who I go to. That's what this 97% is. And we've circled meteorologists a little bit farther down the line. You would think that meteorologists would fall in line. They don't necessarily. It's a different understanding. Economic geologists, obviously, even farther down the line. These are still earth scientists. So you would expect them to have some expertise in this area, and they have some, but it's not enough for them to be truly authoritative about specific questions about climate change. So this is a really tricky problem in terms of how people perceive experts. I think we also suffer a little bit from, I'll call it the Marvel problem, the Marvel Comics problem, right? Because think of every scientist in Marvel Comics. Because if they're a scientist, they know everything about science. And people kind of have that expectation of a scientist. Well, you're a scientist. You tell me about evolution. You tell me about climate change. Well, your response might be, but I'm a biochemist. I mean, what do I know about climate change? But people kind of expect that. So this is a real tricky problem. All right, so now I really want to point out, it's not about education level. This is not something that we can simply blame on a lack of knowledge or a lack of sophistication in somebody's knowledge. People across the spectrum of education levels harbor the same misconceptions that are just susceptible to the same problems that I've been outlining. Evidence shows that higher levels of education, in fact, lead to increased polarization. No matter which side you're on, you'll take that little bit of knowledge you have, even if it's more of a medium amount of knowledge. If you want to support one side, you can find ways to rationalize that, and the more educated you are, in fact, the easier it is for you to do that. We also know that evidence shows that higher education levels lead to more false confidence, right? More of the idea like a meteorologist might have or an economic geologist might have to say, well, yeah, I can speak to climate change. I studied that in school. I know something about that. But not enough. You're not a true expert. It's really hard to give up on that and to be humble enough to admit, I don't know. Let's ask the real experts. Because we're all susceptible to confirmation bias. And if you don't think you are, I'm sorry to say, we are. We're all susceptible to that. It's amazing. Study after study shows just how susceptible we are to this process. All right. And it's not about specific ideology. Again, this talk, it's going to seem like it is. It's going to seem like I'm kind of pointing to one side of the ideological spectrum because these two specific topics, evolution and climate change, do line up where a more conservative ideology would reject these ideas and a more liberal ideology would accept them. But there are other issues, such as GMOs, that would flip that script, and it would be the more liberal ideology that has misconceptions that they're just doggedly holding on to, even in face of evidence, as opposed to a conservative viewpoint. And we're all susceptible to fake experts. I don't think I need to go into that anymore. And we're all susceptible to mystical thinking. And again, I think I've thought about this a lot. You know, I mean, I'm a humanist. I don't have a particular dogmatic faith that influences my thinking, but my wife is currently at Mass singing in the choir. So my family and my extended family run the gamut, right? From people who are very connected to their faith and people who are not. And even those of us who probably are not as connected to a dogmatic faith might still be susceptible, or often still susceptible, to mystical thinking. And again, you might, the crystals and whatever, right? Astrology is becoming a little bit more popular again. So it runs the gamut. And again, to think that we're all independent of this is kind of wishful thinking. We evolved this way. And we all have some of this. So again, I'm hoping that I'm setting a little bit of a table here, because I know I'm speaking to the choir, so to speak, in that we may all feel like we're more rational. But when we're talking to somebody on an issue, we have to acknowledge their own humanity and their own intelligence before we can make any progress with them. And it helps to understand that we might have been less susceptible to misinformation on a specific topic, but we really are just as human as anybody else, and we really need to acknowledge that at the beginning. And that's what we mean by radical empathy, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. So these are the misconceptions that I specifically am focused on. These are not all of them. These are kind of our own wording for some of these. The 5 climate change misconceptions we took directly out of that mailing from the Heartland Institute. The fact that scientists don't agree about climate change, that's a misconception. They do. When you talk specifically to climate scientists, it's actually 98% now instead of 97%. Those remaining 2% include mostly scientists who are just ultimately skeptical, and they really aren't there yet, but could be. And then there's one or two that really are deniers. I mean, that's just their psychology, and they're never going to budge. Models are bad science, according to Heartland Institute, and we'll see a lot of how they try to undermine models as a method. And if you throw out models, then you're throwing out most of the evidence for climate change, not all of it, and in fact not some of the most critical, but it's still an effective strategy to undermine the teaching of climate change or understanding of climate change. They'll often say, well, climate's always changed. What's happening now is no different. It's just natural change. It's always been like this. It's always changed. I mean, look at Earth's history. I'll get to all of these. I'm going to talk about each one of these. I've seen the heads already shaking. Extreme weather, same thing. We've always had extreme weather. So these events are no different than what we've seen throughout even recent history. And then the last one is kind of a different approach, but there's nothing we can do about it anyway, so why get all upset about it? And again, I'll get to that. Evolution misconceptions. These are a little bit harder to align with the strategy that I'm going to lay out here, but I'll do my best. With the climate change ones, it's real easy to use a method we're going to call FLIC. It'll be in my next slide. In a way to identify the logical fallacy, specifically undermining the misconception. Evolutionary concepts are broader, bigger. These misconceptions are more conceptual than specific arguments sometimes. So it's a little bit harder. It's a little bit harder to actually find just an easy to line up, well, here's the misconception, here's the logical fallacy. But we can still do it. I'm going to talk a little bit about the first one, and really the first 2 or 3 I'm going to put into one group for the sake of time, and that is the idea that species evolved because of goal or intention or need or purpose. In other words, if the example you'll see in a little bit is one like Waterworld. Remember that really bad movie with yeah, right. Anyway, where world's covered in water, and so this one individual had gills or developed gills. Because, well, we need them, right? That isn't how evolution works, so we'll walk through that a little bit. The other one, the third one here, is a little bit specifically to a strategy that creationism uses quite often, that is to redefine species as kinds, and to then say that kinds cannot change. You can change within the kind, so there can be some evolutionary changes, adaptation, in other words, but not a speciation. You can't go from one kind to another. This actually lines up with, it's not just certain religious ideologies, but that was Plato's thinking and Plato's ideology. Anyway, I won't go into all of that. I'll do that in some of my lectures, but I'll resist doing that now. The other one is this just a theory. One of the first ones you always hear, oh, it's just a theory. I don't believe in that, it's just a theory. So just a theory, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And then the last one, that evolution is incompatible with faith. And I put this in here because, again, if we're going to have radical empathy, we do need to recognize that we're not going to always get somebody all the way to where we want them if we're really trying to get them on our side. But we can get people to a place where they can really be much more effective at seeing evidence. And part of that is to just defang it, just take the threat out of it. So I'll get a little bit more to that. And again, there are some real examples of this, real scientists who use the strategies that I'm going to outline. All right, so here's John Cook. He's an Aussie. He's from Australia originally, but he's now at George Mason Center for Climate Change Communication. He has a wonderful website called Skeptical Science, and again, there are links in this. If we can make this available to you, you could click on Skeptical Science there, and it'll take you, or this link down here, and it'll take you to his website where he takes climate denial arguments one by one and explains the fallacy and the right information from both a basic to an expert level. Really a wonderful website. This is his approach to things, so we incorporated this into our program, what we teach teachers how to do. We call it FLIC because of fake experts, logical fallacies, impossible expectations, cherry picking, and conspiracy theories, which I'll lump all together into logical fallacy because really they're all essentially different variations of that. Yes? His name is John Cook. All right, so again, I'm going to walk through some of these. Specifically, I'm going to use his cartoons to do it and just kind of give a little bit of a background. I'll start with fake experts. It's a very common strategy to try to present somebody as a fake expert. I mentioned that they're currently trying to set up this fake panel of experts to balance the consensus of climate change, which is a real obvious strategy. The Washington Post, again, there's a link to that headline there. The Times headline, the EPA chief wanted climate science debate. Again, this is, that one was at least rebuffed by the, I think it was John Kelly at the time, but it's going to keep coming up because the people that are on the side of trying to undermine climate science are going to constantly try to present this as a debate. It's not a debate. For one thing, science doesn't proceed by debate. So if we talk about consensus in science, it's not because there are two different sides and they meet somewhere in the middle. It's not compromise. It's consensus because the evidence is telling us the same thing. Different lines of evidence, different scientific approaches, all leading to the same conclusion, leading to a consensus. It's not a compromise. It's not a debate. Now, policy can be debated, but not the science, not the evidence. Right? That's not how we proceed as scientists. So numerous groups present the consensus. Right? It came from the IPCC reports. They're continuing to improve the message more and more powerfully, stronger and stronger message that it's humans causing climate change, and if we don't do something about it pretty soon, it's going to be bad for our economy and for our way of life. The National Academy of Sciences, the U.S. Climate Change Research Progress, or the report, the assessment report that comes out primarily from NOAA, but input from all of the agencies. We also have in our program here, we have a representative, actually the director of education for NOAA. His name is Frank Neipold, and he's working with us on this as well. So when I bring teachers together into a workshop, we have John Cook, we have Frank Neipold, we have Ben Santer call in and talk to them. So I mean, we're bringing heavy guns into this to enable to try to help convince teachers of the importance of teaching climate change. All right, and I'm going to try to go through these fairly quickly. I know I'm probably running behind my schedule here. Logical fallacies. There are a number of these, of course, and John's cartoons are pretty good at pointing to these, so you don't want to jump to conclusions. Pretty far-fetched, but it's not that much different from what James Inhofe tried to do by bringing a snowball into the, I think, Senate chamber, right? And it's sort of the same thing as, the lack of evidence, or it's not. Right. This just reminds me of when your children are learning peekaboo, and you can tell where developmentally they're able to know that just because they can't see you, you're still there. I mean, that's like a thing that we develop very early in our childhood, the ability to understand. Anyway, but I guess James Inhofe never got there. It seems like I'm going to be picking on some politicians. I don't mind picking on individuals, but again, the ideology itself is something that we need to find common ground with and find a way to work from there. Impossible expectations is a strategy that's often used, particularly with modeling. I have Scott Pruitt's quote down here at the bottom where he tries to say what people don't realize is that what scientists have done is just put information into a computer and it spits out these predictions that are really just speculative in nature. There's no real basis behind them. It's not objectively measured, so really they're useless. And that's really not true at all. It also has to do with again, setting up a kind of false dichotomy of sorts. It's not urgent because, there's bigger problems in the world. I think with Wright's Priebus's quote there, I think we all care about our planet, but melting icebergs aren't beheading Christians in the Middle East. There's a lot of emotion in that, right? I mean, that's intended to particularly get to somebody's emotional response and appeal to something else that's more important to them. And then Trump. I mean, I could go on and on about picked out the shortest tweet on this issue, but he tweets on this pretty constantly that, it's cold out, how could there be global warming? We sure could use some of this global warming. You might notice that this GIF is going through a series of undermining this graph, which was a famous graph that was intended to show that climate change predictions based on modeling were completely unreliable and unrealistic, and John has gone through and again sort of highlighted this. So if you have a chance to go back, you can see that. I want to walk through this all, but I put it in there as a GIF intentionally to give you that opportunity. So let me move on to cherry picking. Again, this works in a number of ways. This example of, you commonly hear people talk about, well, CO2 can't be bad. I mean, we all need CO2. CO2 is plant food. It's not a pollutant. It can't be bad. One of the approaches to trying to do something about this is trying to label CO2 as a pollutant so that we can then, through regulations, actually do something to control it. Again, that policy argument is not, it is based on science, but that is a policy argument. The science of this is, of course, requires a lot of sleight of hand, as this mentions. You have to ignore a lot of things in order to try to make that argument. Again, very similar to what Scott Pruitt did in this argument, where he picks out just a small part of the record, where because it's stochastic, you're going to see a lot of ups and downs and trends. It's really on a very long period of time that you see a true trend. We'll talk about it a little bit later. If you pick out just a few years of that, you can actually make almost any claim you want to, and that's where this comes from. That in the late 90s, we actually had a hiatus, and by implication, we're still in it, and we're not. Be somewhat like this, right? It's true, he's moving upwards since they started sinking. Pretty obvious logical fallacy when you see it in a cartoon like this, but they're sticky, they work. And then last, conspiracy theories. Again, there are a number of these. Trump's claiming that it was the Chinese. I think he's backed off of that one a little bit. I haven't heard that recently, but during the campaign, that was his argument. The one that I mentioned, where the plucky band comes from, is this really funny quote, and I've seen it in a number of places. I think Scott Westerfield was the one who first said this, but I'm not positive. The idea that 97% of the world's scientists contrive an environmental crisis, but are exposed by a plucky band of billionaires and oil companies. So I know I'm in being on the side where we're up against a lot of that, just 8 of us, up against quite a bit of money behind some of these strategies. I'm going to move on to this bottom cartoon here, and it actually is just here as a transition. It shows alarmed, concerned, cautious, disengaged, doubtful, and dismissive. These are all categories of people that the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication, they do constant polling, and they ask people whether they are basically questions that allow them to put people's opinions into these areas, whether you're alarmed about climate change, concerned, cautious, disengaged, doubtful, or dismissive. Again, you can find a link to this. It's an amazing program. And you might have noticed in the headlines that we've actually recently seen a really nice increase in the number of people who are concerned or alarmed. Almost 12%, 9 to 12% increase in that. And that's really interesting. That's really because there really is a lot of public support for the side of needing to do something, as opposed to the side of the argument that is still dismissive and doubtful or even disengaged. And if you look at the numbers specifically, you'll notice the biggest jump is in the number of people who were alarmed. Now, most of that increase came from people who were concerned previously and are now alarmed, but the number of people concerned has stayed fairly constant because people who were cautious are now concerned. and even some of the people who were doubtful are now concerned. So that's progress, right? We're making progress. The message is getting out there, and the kids who are currently out there, striking and walking out of their classrooms in order to try to get people to listen, that's one of the best things we can do right now, is just make people listen to this. Make our politicians listen to what is a clear actual majority of people who are, 59%, almost 60% are either concerned or alarmed. But if you think about, if you add the people who are cautiously aware of this issue into that, it's a majority of people. And hopefully if politicians get the message, we can see some improvement soon, maybe in the next administration, right? Hopefully. All right, let me go back through the one approach to dealing with this problem, and this is again John Cook's approach, and that is to unseat the misconception with relevant facts. But if you have to tie the misinformation or the misconception to a fallacy to get people to see how their previous misconception is actually wrong, and that the facts that you're presenting them with are actually right. Now, as an educator, I took this to another level, and we'll get to some of this a little bit forward, because this in itself doesn't always work. Now, he's got some videos where he demonstrates how this is done, and if you've got somebody who's willing to listen, it can work. But if you have somebody who isn't willing to listen, this isn't going to work. So we have to get somebody to that point first, where they're willing to listen and to connect their misconceptions to a fallacy. Because again, people don't like being fooled. People don't like feeling like they've been duped. So if you get them there, this is really effective. If you can get somebody to at least admit the possibility that they have been misinformed, you've made a lot of progress, and then this strategy is actually pretty good. So you may run into a lot of that. I'm going to give an example of how he would undo this. This is Marco Rubio's quote. One of the reasons why the climate is changing is because climate has always been changing. And if you break that into its sort of logical structure, you can recognize there's two assumptions. There's two premises. One, that climate has changed through natural processes, and that climate is currently changing, an acknowledgement of that at least, but then sort of jumping to his conclusion, climate is currently changing through natural processes, which we recognize is jumping to conclusions. It's not really valid conclusion. And the reason why is he's hiding a third premise, and that is that only natural processes can cause climate change, which is a false premise because it's falling into the fallacy of a single cause fallacy. So again, you can find this logical approach to undermining a claim, and if you have somebody willing to listen, that can often work. Let me go through evolution for a little bit. Those were all the kind of a run-through of climate misconceptions, and I just want to give evolution some equal time here. Because we know nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution. And again, this is something that you see this quote, Theodore Dobzhansky's quote, a lot. And it's true. Evolution is the unifying theory of biology. Nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about if you're a scientist versus an applied scientist, like a physician or an engineer. Those are different ways of solving problems. So again, when we're looking at this, an understanding of evolution, you need to look at the experts in evolutionary theory. Don't ask a doctor.
And who is this?
That's Theodore Dobzhansky. Theodore Dobzhansky was a geneticist, one of the early geneticists in the 1920s, who led to what I'm going to talk about in a little bit, what's called the modern synthesis of evolution. But again, numerous organizations have put out quotes of support to this, that evolution is the best way of explaining biology. I mean, it just is. One of the things you typically get thrown at you, of course, is really a lot of problems with vocabulary, because we use the term evolution in different ways. Evolution is a term that simply describes an observable fact. It describes a process of adaptation leading to change over time. All kinds of things evolve. We use this term outside of science even, or in other areas of science. We can talk about the evolution of the universe, the evolution of technology. When we talk about the evolution of life, however, we need a theory to explain it. But there is a fact. Evolution is a fact in the sense that it's observable. We can see it happening. We can see it happening right in front of our eyes. We can manipulate the process and sort of make it happen for our own purposes, and we can see evidence of it throughout Earth's history. So on that side of things, but it's also the title that is still attached to the theory. And it's a theory of evolution by natural selection. That was Darwin's original theory, and that has gone through, again, a modern synthesis and updated since then. That's unfortunate in a sense, that the term evolution has become a label for the theory because it obscures the idea that it's a fact. You hear people say all the time, well, it's just a theory, it's not fact. It's both. But it's hard to say it's both and have anybody listen to that unless you can get them to a point where they're willing to. The word theory itself has multiple meanings, right? So the way that, well, I'll show you in a little bit, a politician uses it, just a theory. The idea that it's just a theory, that it's just an unproved assumption or just a sort of belief that's put in place in order to, for the sake of an argument or whatever, and not a grand explanatory framework for an entire branch of science. That's how scientists use the term theory, and it's a unique way of using the term, and again, it's unfortunate that it's been shortened to just that one word when we talk about it in larger contexts, outside of the context of science. So again, I won't go through all this evidence of what the, I've essentially said that the fact of evolution are observable and that we can see and manipulate the process, and that the theory of evolution is how we explain it, how it works, and use that explanation to make predictions of things that we haven't found yet or we don't know yet, and it's worked over and over and over again. Evolution has been probably, maybe, the most successful theory in all of science. That may be arguable, I may be a little overstating it, but it's certainly one of. I mean, it's very, very well vetted over centuries, century and a half of experimentation that has made predictions, found those predictions to be true, and not been undermined by real evidence. Yes?
A question about the word theory. Once something becomes a theory, there's nothing beyond that. It turns into a theory. It's always a theory.
Yeah, well, his question is, once something becomes a theory, there's nothing beyond that. That's really the ultimate aspect of science, and in a sense, that's true because. But the way of thinking of a theory is it's not a hierarchical series of explanation. It's a method, it's an engine of asking questions and finding answers to those questions and solving problems. And so you take all of what we know, all of the facts, all of the observations of what we know, you explain them. You find a way to explain all of that, and that becomes your theory. And then from that theory you can say, okay, so if all of this is explained this way, then we can predict an explanation for something else that we don't already know about. Ultimately, you do away with theories if you could ever answer every question, right? So if you ever answered every question in biology, you wouldn't need a theory anymore, it would go away. It also is something that a theory is set, it can't vary, otherwise it's not science. But it can be replaced, and that doesn't mean you throw away everything else that's in the theory. Yeah, I've got a couple hands real quick, let me answer this one and then I'll come to you.
Repeat my question.
Yes, I'll repeat the question.
My background is in physics, and we have the opposite problem in that a lot of our ideas are called laws.
Right.
And people think that they're absolutely true, as in Newton's laws and the laws of thermodynamics, and they're really just approximations. But
right.
On the other hand, we got sensitive to this topic, and the theory that with the highest prediction value to 12 significant digits was named the standard model. Mm-hmm. So we went to the opposite extreme in calling it a model.
Yeah, I think those are interesting points. Let me try to summarize what he said. As a physicist, and he's a physicist, they use the term law to talk about, in many ways, the same way that we might use a different term in a different branch of science. But laws are approximations in physics. They're not absolutely true. If you think about the laws, Newton's laws, for instance, Einstein obviously expanded on those and kind of showed we needed further explanation. And so general relativity, special relativity, kind of expand on that. We're currently looking for another one. Anyway, time. I do have to move on. Let me move on and we'll answer questions at the end. I've got 10 minutes to go, so I apologize right now, but let me keep going. And again, the problems with, or the differences, they're not problems, but differences between physics are interesting. I find those very fascinating, actually. Let me briefly go through this, because again, I want to get to that last part of my talk where I talk about what we're doing about it and what you can do about it. So very quickly, I won't elaborate on these, but the idea that evolution has an intention, that there's a purpose, that it's leading in a specific direction. I mean, this series of from monkey to humans is a misconception because it's not linear. There's no end result that was in place as a purpose for evolution and so forth. My favorite cartoon of all time, Great Moments in Evolution, as if the need to get the baseball would be enough to lead to the evolution of limbs in fish. I love that cartoon, it's great. Yeah, they even have a bat. It's hilarious. I love that. And again, so I won't go through a lot. I'm running out of time, so I won't go through all this. You can go through this. There's very many examples of how creationism and intelligent design continue to be supported, or issues that people support. Essentialism is kind of the idea that undermines that idea of kinds, that you can't have speciation because creation creates a kind. You can have adaptations within that kind, but it can't turn from one thing to another. Part of this is a misconception about species, exactly what a species is, and that's what this series of lizards around the Baja Peninsula are to illustrate. These are different populations of lizards. Each subsequent population are able to interbreed, so you would not designate them as separate species. But if you get around to the end and you try to breed Platensis or a Genensis, they can't. They can't interbreed. So you would have to call them a different species given our typical definition of species. The scientists, biologists don't necessarily rely just on that definition, but where does that happen exactly? Because each subsequent generation can reproduce with the next. But when you get all the way around to the end, they can't. This is called a ring species. There are a number of them, but I'm not teaching you biology, so I won't get there. All right, again, real quickly, United States on this list. Oh my goodness, it's all the way down there. Right? We are really, as a country, pretty far behind on our ability to educate our population significantly or sufficiently on these topics. Turkey is a little worse off than we are, but anyway, so I won't belabor that point too much. It is interesting that much of the resistance to this has simply to do with ourselves, that we're somehow separate from this. If you ask people about elephants, they're much more likely to agree that evolution led to current species of elephants. That's an interesting thing to think about, obviously. I've been mentioning this over and over again, that there's actually a modern synthesis. I mean, when Darwin develops his idea of natural selection, he didn't understand DNA or the laws of inheritance. He didn't even have Mendel's classical genetics laws in his mind. They were sitting on his desk, but he didn't read it. So there's since been a lot of discoveries that have really helped support evolution. I mean, it's been amazing how well our discovery of DNA and genetics have solidified natural selection as the explanation for evolution, rather than undermining it. So as a theory, it's gotten stronger and stronger, and it's sort of the modern theory of evolution includes this modern synthesis. Real quickly, I can't ignore this cartoon, because I love this cartoon. It says, "Ignore it, Jeffries, it's unscientific." Now, I've given these as tests, as bonus questions on my tests for my students for a long time. If you can explain to me why this is funny, you get extra points, you get extra credit. And usually, I'll give partial credit, so usually they'll recognize that, well, we would never find a dragon fossil because dragons weren't real. And some might also point out, well, and they don't form this way. They don't form across stratigraphic layers in a sort of a vertical way like that. And there isn't enough time since the medieval period for a fossil to form. Like, okay, good. You get a couple points for that. But what really makes this funny is that if we were to find that fossil, we would have to account for it. Science would not ignore it. Now, there have been hoaxes of fossil finds. They've been shown to be hoaxes, but they're taken seriously because that's how science progresses. And if we were to find that fossil, we'd have to explain it. And I love that aspect of science, right? The fact is it's the evidence that tells us what we know. It's not any bias. It's not any preconceived idea. It's evidence. And if we find evidence that is reliable evidence that we can show as reliable, we can't just throw it away. So that's one step to getting people to realize science isn't trying to trick you. We're not trying to fool you. We're not presenting, a consensus that's from conspiracy. Scientists are their own worst enemies in that regard. We attack each other's ideas all the time because we need to find and make sure that the evidence that we're relying upon is really reliable. Again, I won't go through this real quickly, the various ways that this relates more to education and trying to undermine the education of evolution and climate change. It's just a theory, teach the controversy, debate it. It sounds fair to people outside of science. They might think, sure, debate it. consider the evidence for and against, and the strengths and weaknesses. But through court case after court case, that we've proven that these are all just stand-ins for the idea of creationism, and so they've been rejected over and over again. The more recent one that we're seeing right now, where they're throwing it out as ethical practice, and so they'll try to say, knowing that there's controversy about climate change, it would be unethical for teachers not to teach both sides. It's just another way, trying to label it in a way that looks reasonable. Sure, teachers should be ethical, but it probably, if they are, it's not the outcome the people who put that language in the standards want. So just to run through, again, I'm not going to go through this, but all of them together kind of give us this explanation. The last one being that we're incompatible with faith. I'm going to skip past this one real quickly, though I did mention Benjamin Carson here, the fact that physicians are applying science. They're not scientists. They're not doing science method. So just like meteorologists and climate change, you often find your fake experts in that branch for evolution. In fact, most major religions have put out statements in support of evolution rather than against it, and we've compiled all of this in our own database you can find on our website. It's an interesting breakdown of different religious thinking on the subject that are more or less willing to accept evolution. But I wanted to get to this one. It's called consilience. I like the term consilience. It's one that E.O. Wilson used again to try to find a way that people that are talking about science and people that are talking about faith can kind of come together. It's really, whether it's possible or not is still to be determined. Francis Collins is the director of the National Institute of Health. He's a very effective scientist. He wrote The Language of God. He's very much of the opinion that you can worship God just as thoroughly through an understanding of science, being God's methods, as you can. You know, that science doesn't undermine God. It's explaining how he works. That's one way to find consilience, if people are willing to go there. Stephen Gould famously sort of came up with the two magisteria, the separate but equal magisteria, that these are simply two ways of explaining different aspects of reality. Science explains natural phenomena that can't explain faith. Faith explains its own things, meaning, and things like that, that science doesn't really address. So really, it's just two completely separate things, and we just need to keep them in their own houses, which isn't really possible ultimately. E.O. Wilson is the one who just simply comes in and mentions what I said at the beginning, that religion is evolutionary psychology. We evolved to be religious thinkers, mystical thinkers. So if we recognize that about ourselves, it's kind of like the same way that we crave fats and sugars. We evolved because we needed them. They were rare in our environment. Now we don't need, they're easily available. So if we recognize that as an evolved craving, we can more easily overcome that. And he describes religion in a similar way. So again, there's kind of a progression of arguments that would be least challenging to somebody who's faithful to the most challenging to someone who's faithful, but I just put that out there as something that we can do. So what are we doing about it? What is NCSE doing about it? I've got 3 minutes. I've got my program, the Teacher Ambassador program I mentioned. Again, Kate, I'll just mention these are my ambassador teachers. I've got 3 groups right now, 2 for climate change, 1 for evolution. We'll have another evolution group this summer and a nature of science group this summer, so we'll eventually have about 50 all over the country. So these teachers are able to do workshops and give presentations where they are. They were specifically chosen to come from areas where there is resistance. It may not always look like that in the city, but their essays and their applications which describe specific resistance in their communities. These are teachers who know what they're doing, they're very good at it, they're going to train the teachers around them who aren't very good at it. Our other outreach program, community outreach program, this is Kate Carter. She's our newest member, and she's kind of revamping our community outreach programs that have included booster clubs and other things, but she also is reaching across the country to use fellows and to organize community volunteers and do community events. It's a lot of fun. Glenn Branch, our deputy director, again, is the one who organizes all of our efforts to deal with the resistance, the flare-ups. This is not the most recent. If you go to the Washington Post article, which just appeared this last week, it outlines the current things that are going on. There's like 20 different bills around the country that are trying to undermine the teaching of evolution and climate change. And most of them aren't going to make it out of committee. Those that do, we have people in place that he helps organize in each of these communities to help fight that. All right, so what can you do about it? Now, this is where radical empathy comes in. If you are dealing with somebody who is arguing against climate change or evolution, you want to, again, appeal to their humanity, recognize their intelligence, but talk about it locally. Talk about something that's real, something that they could really experienced. Again, that's really important. But you talk about it in every context. Climate change is impacting not just education, not just our economy, our food supply, what cars we drive, on and on and on. But there is hope. There is hope that we can do something about this. So I don't have time to walk through the method, what we call our no-conflict approach, which is a way to de-escalate tensions at the beginning, connect to somebody, and connect to their humanity, and then get to a scientific argument where they are able to see evidence in a different way and able to change their thinking. So I'll scroll through this fairly quickly. The main thing is don't debate. It's not a debate. It's just like one of the scientists we work with is Amanda Glaze, who's an evolutionary scientist in Georgia. She grew up in an evangelical household, and she's still very strong faith. But she always tells people, I don't believe in evolution. Just like I don't believe in gravity, right? It's not a belief. It's not something to believe in or not believe in. There's no opposite of believing in terms of evolution. It just is. You accept it or you don't accept it. So it kind of diffuses the issue. It kind of moves it. So you realize, okay, yeah, it's not really a debate. A traditional approach to people would be more adversarial. You might come into a confrontation thinking somebody is there intentionally to argue with you. They know who you are. They know what you think. And they're, whatever situation you're finding this conversation arising in. So you would have a more adversarial objective going in, that you're either going to win or lose or not engage. When in fact, most people aren't looking for conflict. And if we really do recognize that, if we're in a social situation in which these conversations come up, whether it's Thanksgiving or even a different social setting at a museum, most people are there looking for a way to connect and a way to find common ground. And people who ask you about climate change really are trying to test out where you are. Where do you align? Not as much to be adversarial as to be sort of to delineate where each of you are. Now, as soon as you say something, it might raise people's hackles, and then you're kind of in a more... But you shouldn't go in with the expectation of that. You should be kind, treat people as intelligent, acknowledge the legitimacy of the conversation. It is a legitimate conversation, even though the science is not debatable. What we do about it, the policy, is a legitimate conversation. And we can find room for agreement. We can find something we agree on. And it usually has to do with solutions. You may notice that if you have a conversation like this with people, you may agree about what's something that we can do to help the world, to help change things. This is from Project Drawdown, which is a list of all of the most important things to do for climate change that have the biggest impact in terms of the amount of CO2 put into the atmosphere. Many of them also have major economic impacts. And so there's a lot of room for agreement here. You might find a lot of people who agree with different alternative energy explanations, but not in climate change. It's actually really interesting how that works. A lot of people will agree with the need to replace oil and gas, but more from, again, a pollution standpoint than a climate change standpoint. But if you can agree on that, well, you've gone a long way to getting them to understand about climate change, and so on. So again, I don't have time to go through these very much. My son, my 21-year-old son, the other day asked me, what I do, and I told him. He said, "Wow, that's really. What can I do about climate change?" And the first thing that popped in my head, of course, was vote. Right? He's 21, so he didn't vote the last time. We couldn't encourage him to do that, which But next time he's going to vote. He said, "Okay, I can do that." Anyway, there's a lot more to do about it. Talk about it. All this is to go to the point of talk about it. Have these conversations, but do them in a way that's going to be effective. All right, I finally made it through. I'm only 2 or 3 minutes over.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. So remember, hold the microphone close to your mouth. It may seem like it's close, but it's got to be really close. Okay, so I'll remind you. I'll go through and try to pick out people in the order their hands are up or how I can walk around the room.
Sure.
But we're only going to take about 10 minutes because we normally stop at 8:15.
I guess I used up all my question time. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'd like to have this retooled for a special universe, multi-universe. One is the universe of 12, multi-universes of 12, and another one universe of 9. Where am I going? Courtroom and the Supreme Court.
Okay.
With retool all your concepts for
Right.
that group.
That's a good point. If we can make an argument that would be successful in a courtroom, there are court cases in the process of going through, and they may end up at the Supreme Court. So I'm sure there are a lot of lawyers trying to figure out that problem. Yes, sir.
Well, I'm a little puzzled. What is actually taught these budding teachers in these teaching colleges? Because they are very important. They will be teaching in grade
Right.
schools and high schools.
Right.
And that is where these foundations are made in their mind.
Right.
The parents are kind of hopeless. But at any rate, it must be done at that level.
Right.
Do they really have the guts
let me-
to cover these things?
Yeah, well, that is one of our biggest points is to get
One more
underneath the
question.
problem before it becomes a problem. You're right about pre-service teachers. So pre-service teachers are a real focus of ours. Many of our ambassadors will be presenting to pre-service teachers. I've taught those classes for much of my own career, teaching teachers about science and how to teach it. So we are going to go after those teachers. Again, if we can get to them before they're affected by misconceptions, and that's why the curriculum that we develop can be taught in 5th grade, as well as middle school and high school. So we really do want to get to students before they form misconceptions.
Yeah. I would like to add one point.
I'm sorry, he wants to
An
get...
expert is defined as 190 miles from home.
An expert, yes, 90 miles from home. You do want to find, again, local help. Being local helps, yes.
I love some of your slides. Are they online?
I have
see
not
them?
made them available yet, but I will. I can also put
Let
them
us
in.
know.
I can put them in my website too, and again, you can get there here. If you go to the sandbox, I'll put them there.
Okay.
We are in the process of redeveloping our website. Our website's going to be completely different in a couple months. So right now, I've got everything in this particular spot, which is why I call it my sandbox. But I will put this presentation there, and I imagine they'll make it available to you in some way. Yes.
So how can we help people identify fake experts? That seems to be a
Yeah.
major thing. They're believing the wrong people.
Right. Now, that's a real challenge, and that's why our focus is to always get them to the evidence first. If you get people to really think about the evidence, and there are certain lines of evidence that are pretty much impossible to explain any other way except by human impact.
Thank you.
And I don't have time to go through those, but that's part of our education thing. But if you can get people to really focus on the fact that maybe they're in an agricultural community and the farmers are having to rethink what they're planting and how they're doing their irrigation and all these different things that they're having to change practices, you get them to recognize that, recognize why is that important, and then you get to the idea that climate is really changing and the idea of which experts then are authoritative about that. That's down the line. You don't start with the experts, you get to the experts, but you need to get people to engage with something. They have to engage with some kind of understanding. From an educational standpoint, this is called constructivism. You have to construct your own understanding. I can't tell you anything. If you don't construct your own understanding, it's not real understanding, it just flips away. And that's true of everybody. Yes, in the back.
Hi, Dana St. George. Yeah, I'm reading a book by Dr. Ornish right now, who's a kind of a diet doctor. But anyway, he maintains that statistics show that two of the main things that are contributing to global warming and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere are the eating of meat and transportation.
Right.
And he maintains that actually the eating of meat is contributing more pollution to the atmosphere even than transportation.
Number
So
4.
if people could just stop eating meat and drive electric cars, would that help a lot?
It would help tremendously. As I mentioned, moving more towards a plant-rich diet is number 4 on the list of the most effective things we can do. Right behind reducing food waste, so not throwing away stuff. I mean, restaurants and grocery stores throw away 40% of the food consistently. So those two things are extremely important. The transportation one's a little bit farther down the list, and I'm not going to call it a red herring because it's not on the top 20, but it is because it is important. But in terms of an actual tons of carbon thing, it's a lot more important to, as you said, eat less meat and to do different agricultural things and to look for alternative energy sources. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay, we'll just have one more question, I guess. We're getting really to the end here.
Yeah.
I was reading an interesting article in Scientific America, or as one of those. There is a disease I'd never heard of, which is being spread by ticks.
Okay.
And it causes you to be allergic to meat forever. All
true.
animal products you will be allergic to.
Yeah, no, I've seen that. You're right. There is a disease like that. Just to point out that the spread of disease is one of the major consequences of climate change, because the disease vectors, like ticks, are changing their ranges or expanding their ranges. So that's actually a very valid point to bring up. I don't know if your question was to maybe encourage that particular affliction, but it might be some way to do it, yes.
Very good talk, and also very good initiative that's been taken.
Thank you.
But I have questions like a lot of these denials and all these stuffs are embedded in the financial and political agendas.
Right.
And how you're going to tackle that, because it's a capitalist systems and they want profit. Everything is based on finance and politics. So how you're going to deal with that?
Well, that is, I think that does underlie a lot of the difficulty. It's not only a source of the misinformation, but a lot of why we're up against a lot, and they're going to keep doing the misinformation campaigns. But it is a gradual process. If you look at how tobacco industry, that eventually was kind of convincing. The public got to the point where they realized, yes, this is causing cancer, we're not going to listen to the industry. Pharmaceutical industry, similarly, oil and gas industry, similarly. I mean, it's just a matter of moving the needle, which is why on that latest Yale survey, the fact that we saw a 9 to 12% increase in that acceptance of climate change, human-caused climate change, is a very positive indication. Eventually, voters will prevail, but it's a very long process.
Okay, so that should finish it up. I know you have a lot more to say. It's
Sure.
too bad we didn't allow for more time or whatever.
No, it's
Anyway,
good.
let's give a hand to our speaker.
Thank you so much.